And for more on the growing threat from the Islamic State and the White House's strategy to battle the terror group, we're joined by two guests. Andrew Borene is here with us in Washington, D.C. He's an advisor with the Criminal Counsel of the Truman National Security Project. It's a development program which helps influence policy, politics, and public opinion. And Mike Lyons joins us in New York. He's a senior fellow also at the Truman National Security Project and a retired major with the U.S. Army. Gentlemen, thank you both for being here tonight.
Thanks for having us.
Mike, let's start with you. The U.S. has just marked the September 11th attacks. Do you think the world is safer from terror than it was 13 years ago? What's different for the better and for the worst?
Well, there's no question we're more vigilant in the United States. I think for 9/11 to have had happen the way it did, there was many operational things that went right. I think it would be very difficult to do the same thing again. We clearly have much more systems in place. People are much more aware of it. But it just goes to show you, here we are 13 years after, we still are dealing with a terrorist organization, and that we've got to really come up with a strategy to manage it and continue to manage it because it's not likely it's going away anytime soon.
Andrew, I want to bring you in because it was 13 years ago. It was a different president, a different political administration. What is different now than was then? Are we better off?
Well, I think there's a difference between how we feel and the actual state of security around the world. I think people today certainly feel less safe. And it has a great deal to do with the rise of ISIS on social media. I think the recent beheadings of U.S. journalists and the awareness that 1,000 Western Europeans and perhaps 100 American passport or citizenship paper holders may be participating in this fight with ISIS in Iraq, which really makes it a more real, tangible type of a threat. That said, in the last 13 years, the United States has undertaken many counterterrorism reforms. Intelligence Reform Terrorism Prevention Act came about. We invented the National Counterterrorism Center. Law enforcement began cooperating with the intelligence community. The Transportation Security Administration implemented a great deal of security as people all over the world enter air travel. So I think in many ways, a lot of reforms have been taken and actions have been taken from the counterterrorism, anti-terrorism perspective that do make the world a safer place. That said, as the Major said, the threat has not gone away, and there are a great many al-Qaeda imitators throughout radical forms of Islam that the President last night made a point did not reflect the faith as we understand it. But those radicals are a threat to people all over the world, and this may be a very long struggle against that radical element.
Well, and what seems more alarming this time around is IS seems so much bigger. Another report coming out that the CIA is saying 30,000 IS fighters. Before, we had no idea where al-Qaeda was or how big it was. Now we're seeing these huge numbers. So politically, with the U.S. president making this speech, outlining a strategy, can he lead this coalition? Can these countries that are starting to come on board stay the course?
That's a great question. I think politically, the situation has changed today from a decade ago. This threat really does threaten moderate Sunni nations. Nations like Turkey, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Jordan feel threatened by this really, I hesitate to call it an insurgency because it's really a terrorist faction. But it has grown and they're occupying real estate and they're threatening their neighbors in ways that they weren't before. So I think the likelihood of developing a regional alliance, particularly in the form of a more unified Iraqi government in Baghdad, does change the game quite a bit in terms of what the United States needs to do. So I think you'll see a great deal more air power, intelligence and surveillance support to this activity, but it'll look a lot more like a counterterrorism campaign and a lot less like a conventional war.
Mike, what do you think? What did you think of the president's plan militarily? Do you think airstrikes will be effective?
Yeah, I think so. I think he gave the chairman of the Joint Chiefs enough intent to work off of. And I do think those airstrikes will be definitely effective, especially if ISIS decides to fight conventionally. If they go out in the wide open and think they're going to win across some of those Iraqi plains that I've seen, they're going to be no match for the U.S. air power that'll just tear them apart, literally. So the question is how they fight if they change their tactics. You know, they're going to make mistakes on, and I think our strategy right now is we've blunted them initially, we've kept them from moving advanced and forward, and now we've got a tourniquet on, and we're going to start to attrit them down, and I think very quickly you'll see some airstrikes start to do that.
But because, you know, Syrian government is basically saying that no one can strike unless you have approval of the Syrian government. How do you work, or how do these countries all work together to get this done?
Well, I think the president has marginalized Assad right now, and I think that we've taken Syria, we've taken him off the table. We're going to ignore the border just like ISIS has at this point. And while the first objective might be to restore the Iraqi border, I think that if we see these targets, especially going after the heads of ISIS and command and control centers inside of Syria, they're going to be attacked. I don't think the Syrian air defenses are going to be, again, no match for what the American firepower will bring.
How long do you see this playing out, Andrew?
I
mean, John Kerry is still traveling around trying to get people to commit.
Well, and I think it's early for this new phase of a counterterrorism campaign, if we can say that. There was a long, extended counterinsurgency campaign in Iraq, and today is the first day since the president outlined his four-pronged strategy to address this threat. Only this month has American public opinion shifted from 2/3 against military intervention in Syria to 2/3 supporting military intervention in Syria in the form of airstrikes. So I think this is the beginning of a change today. And the follow-on I think we see from this is that the president has asserted his leadership. He's working to build a strong international coalition to work with those regional allies that can provide ground troops. But I think the next steps are going to be congressional action. There's going to be a heavy demand for Congress to do things like finish needed reforms under the Intelligence Reform Terrorism Prevention Act. The 9/11 Commission made recommendations that remain unfulfilled today. And the Budget Control Act, or some people know it as the sequester, creates a $52 billion shortfall in the Pentagon budget. So Congress has a pretty short clock left this session, but they've got significant issues they need to look at, including funding the U.S. Department of Defense in effectively what has become a time of a new counterterrorism campaign in new real estate in Iraq and Syria.
And now, as we know, IS isn't the only group out there. Mike, I'll let you have the last word. How do you get a handle of all these groups in other parts of the world as well? Africa, Asia even, we're seeing some action there.
I think once you see success, countries will line up. They'll want to be on the winning side. But to expound on Andrew's point, it is going to take a long time, especially to get Arab nations that are fundamentally rivals to work shoulder to shoulder. If there's 1,000 things that have to be done in order for us to say we've been successful here, we're probably on the 8th or 10th thing at this point in time. There's so many things that have to have happened. So I think we're going to continue to go down this path of doing things very sequentially, making sure that we're on pace and on step, and building what's going to be a very difficult political coalition on the ground to when we finally have to virtually invade Syria and rebuild Syria, we'll be ready to go.
All right, Mike Lyons in New York, Andrew Borene here in Washington. Thank you both for joining us here on the show.
Thanks for having us.